Hi everyone! Welcome back. This is the fourth video in this series where I am teaching kids who are complete beginners how to hand sew. Now, over the course of the past three videos, we have learned how to get ready to sew, we've learned 2 basic stitches, and we have learned how to sew on some buttons. And so now I'm going to teach you how you can put all those skills together to make a super cute little stuffed toy. Alright, so the first thing you're going to want to do, if you haven't already, is get yourself a needle and thread it, just like I showed in the previous video. So if you need a reminder, feel free to go take a look at that. But I've gone ahead and done that off camera. And so if you still need to, pause the video here to get that done. Let's go ahead and get started. So I've got my threaded needle, but I'm gonna actually set it aside for just a second while we focus on the fabric. And so for this project, we're actually gonna need to cut our fabric into 2 circles. So I'm going to fold the fabric in half, and then I'm going to take just any old pen that I have lying around, and I am just going to roughly draw a circle that's pretty big. I'm going to take up as much of this circle. I'm going to draw a circle that's pretty big. I'm going to take up as much of this as I can, and you should be able to draw with just any pen. If you're using black fabric, that might be a little bit trickier. If you can find a white colored pencil or anything like that, that should help show up a bit better. And similarly with brown or any other dark color, but if you have white or any light color, anything should show up. So I'm just going to trace out a circle. It doesn't have to be perfect. I'm not going to get something round to compare, but just a rough circle that's about as big as I can get it with this fabric folded in half. And so now that I have that, and I'm pretty happy with the shape, let me just fix up this little corner a bit. I'm going to cut it out, and I'm going to cut through both layers of fabric so the 2 circles will be exactly the same. So I'm just going to grab my scissors, and just keeping the fold in exactly the same place, I'm just going to cut right around it. And so with that, I now have both of my circles. They're exactly the same. So then I'm going to hang on to this scrap piece. I'm not going to throw it out because we'll use it towards the end of our project. So I'm just going to set it right aside, and I'm going to go back to my needle, and I'm going to sew on 2 buttons. So you're going to want to use 2 buttons that are the same. So these are the 2 I had lying around. They're just 2 small white ones, and they don't show up great against the white fabric, but they'll do for this purpose. And so I'm going to sew on the first one, and we're going to do it exactly like we did last time we were teaching buttons. So again, if you need a reminder of how that works, you can check out the previous video. And I'm going to put the 2 of them right here-ish. They're going to be the 2 eyes of our little friend that we're baking. And you're going to want to leave a pretty significant border so that you can sew these 2 circles together a little bit later on. So make sure your 2 eyes are in the same line-ish, but leaving plenty of space for later. I'm going to take the one off for now and just hold this one in place while I do exactly the same button sewing on method that we learned earlier. All right, and I'm satisfied that my button is nice and tight, so I'm going to tie it off. And then we're going to do the exact same thing with the other button, making sure to remember that these are eyes. I'm going to try and keep them in line while still leaving ample space for later. And now I'm done with the second button, and I'm going to tie it off. And now I'm going to give my friend a mouth, and I'm just going to draw on his mouth. I'm going to give him a little bit of a smile, just right down here. And so now he's all happy. And now we are going to sew our two circles together. So I'm gonna line them up. Mine isn't a perfect circle, so I'm gonna try and find where they line up. And then I'm going to sew around this border that we've left. Again, you can tell mine doesn't line up perfectly. Again, mine doesn't line up perfectly. It's got a couple little guys sticking out there, but that is okay. We can always trim it at the end if we don't want it. But what we're going to do now is we're going to sew all the way around the edge, and I want this seam to last, so I'm going to use the back stitch because, as we discussed, that is going to hold it longer than a standard running stitch. So for this needle that I'm threading right now, I'm going to cut a slightly longer thread than I have been for the past projects because it has to go a lot further around. This perimeter is a lot more thread than you would use for just a button. So I have a nice long piece of thread here that I am going to thread through my needle. Took me a couple tries. And then I will tie it off at the other end. Exactly the same way we've been doing. One over the other and through. And then repeating that process so the knot holds. One over the other and through. And then grabbing both ends of the thread and pulling tight. Clipping the end pieces hanging off, putting them aside. So now I've got my needle threaded, and I'm going to pick a place around this little toy we're making to start. So for me, I'm going to start right down here, but it really doesn't matter at all. But we're going to start this one a little bit differently. For everything else, we've just been coming straight up from the back. But if we do that here, because we have 2 layers, the back is actually also going to be a side that we want our piece to look good on. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to bring up my needle in between the 2 layers. That way, as these 2 pieces get sewn together, this little knot and these little spare threads will get hidden inside the project. So now that my knot is hidden, I'm going to sew my first stitch. And from here, I can start just sewing to the back like we normally would, all the way through both layers of fabric. Sorry, I've got some extra thread stuck on there. And then again, just doing that back stitch, so coming up a little bit further ahead and coming down through the hole created by the last stitch. And then we're just going to repeat that process. All right, so now I've made it almost all the way around the face, but I've left a little gap here, and you should too, because at this point, we're actually going to add stuffing inside our little friend, so he's squishy like a normal stuffed animal would be. But instead of using traditional stuffing, which is white fluffy cotton that you can actually find, we're actually just going to use those scraps. So remember how I said to save them? Well, here's where they come up. So I'm going to take this scrap of felt and I'm going to cut it into small pieces. So setting my friend away for a second, we're going to cut them into pieces about that size, and they don't really matter the shape because we aren't going to be showing them. They're not going to be visible. So I'm just roughly cutting all of my felt into little pieces. So now I've done a lot of cutting and I have all these little pieces of felt. And so I'm going to bring back my little friend. Now I'm going to open up right here. And as you can see, there's like a little hollow right inside. And so I'm going to leave my string dangling. I'm not going to tie it off just yet. And I am going to take all these little pieces of felt and just put them right inside the little pocket that we've made. And I'm just going to make it stuffed with these little pieces of felt. So making sure to get every little nook and cranny so he's equally puffy all the way around. And I'm going to put, it looks like I'm going to wind up putting all of my felt scraps in there. You might not, that all just depends on how puffy you want it and how much felt scraps you have. But I'm just going to take them all, put them in there. And there we go, that's all done. And now he's very puffy, but he's still open here. So because we didn't tie off that string, we're just going to take the same string again and just keep going with our back stitch, making sure that we're trapping all of the felt scraps inside. So I'm just checking to make sure I'm not sewing through any stuffing scraps. And then I'm just finishing off around the border. And so now here I am, I've made it back to my last stitch. I've got one more to do. And so I have my thread at the back and I'm going to pull it up through the first hole we made actually. So that ending of the last stitch. And then I'm going to put it back through this hole, but I'm going to do the same thing we did earlier where I'm going to hide the thread on the inside. So I'm going to peel open my border a little bit and push the needle out in between the two layers, just like that. And then when I pull that nice and taut, I've got a little, this stitch is sewn up, but the thread is right there in between the two layers. And then I'm going to cut out the needle. And then I'm going to tie the two strands together just like we have for every other knot. Then when we pull it taut, it goes right there into that border. And then I'm going to do it one more time. So it's extra tight. And then you know what, once more, to be extra careful. And so as you can see on the back, it's not super pretty just by nature of how a back stitch winds up looking, but we have no loose threads because as soon as we trim the threads on that last stitch, they are all hidden right in there. And then if you're like me, you probably have a pretty uneven border, but that's okay. I'm going to trim around a little bit just to make sure the outside between the stitching and the end of the fabric is just a little bit more even. I'm just going to shave some off over here. But overall, that is your little toy. He's all finished and you can give him a name. I'm going to name mine Hubert. I think he looks like a bit of a Hubert. And there you have it. So you've made your own stuffed, squishy, fluffy toy.